The low sun washed FOB Raven Rock in a shallow, gold-stained light. Dust hung in soft ribbons around the perimeter, and a cluster of rangers lounged near a Humvee, their chatter loose and loud. They traded barbs about the day's orders, rolling their eyes at the intel update that cautioned against a nearby valley. The contractor who had flagged the route became the target of their scorn. She was soft, they said, too academic for the real work. She belonged behind a desk. She didn't belong on the line. Staff Sergeant Riley Monroe stood out from their jokes only by being quiet. At 34, she gave the impression of someone who preferred a small life. An unobtrusive routine, a corner desk, a low profile. Her posture was careful and unassuming. She moved through the base in ways that allowed the edges of her to blur. That invisibility had been deliberate for years. It had been her shelter. Inside the cramped intelligence office, she kept her station organized to a degree most people would not notice. Pens aligned, maps folded the same way every morning, a routing of files and notes that made sense only to her. Screens cast a pale glow across her face. Radios hissed at the edges of the room. She produced concise analyses, flagged hazards, and drew attention to terrain features that could shape a patrol's fate. Her coworkers read what they needed in a glance, offering nods of approval and rarely more. Curtis Hale skimmed reports and moved on. Veronica Shaw sighed at anything that demanded time. Brad Nolan dissolved discomfort behind jokes. None of them suspected the history beneath Riley's quiet. Once, she had carried more than a tablet. Once the posture and discipline belonged to someone who shoulders a rifle and bears responsibility for other people's lives. That life ended the way ruptures often do, abrupt and ugly, carved by betrayal and leadership failures that punished honesty. She walked away from the weapon and its hold on her. The promise she made to herself was simple and absolute, never to let that tool again define the course of her life. So she cut connection, turned to a civilian path, and made herself small. Still, proximity to soldiers triggered old reflexes. When squads cycled through the base, Riley observed them with a familiarity that suggested a former life. Captain Mason Ridge carried himself with quiet command. Sergeant Cole Turner moved with the sharp efficiency of a quick reaction leader. Specialist Dana Brooks edged into tasks with a tentative, earnest determination. Riley noticed details: how Ridge set his shoulders when he entered a briefing, how Turner checked his gear, how Dana moved to aid a buddy without seeking recognition. Her training recognized theirs before they ever saw her. She kept her distance deliberately. She turned her intelligence into support. Maps, overlays, probabilities. She handed them the information she had and kept her hands on the keyboard so she would not feel the reflex to reach for a weapon. She had sworn off that path, and she honored the promise. Yet hidden beneath the calm was an ache, a tether to the people who walked outside the wire. She could hear what it meant to be called over a static channel and not be able to answer. That knowledge was a weight she carried alone. When the call came into the Tactical Operations Center, it cleaved the day in two. At first, the static, choked voice sounded like routine contact. Then the panic edged in. Rangers ambushed, multiple wounded. They were surrounded. The rhythm in the room shifted. Radios went quiet while people leaned toward speakers. Curtis sat up. Veronica muted her screen. Even Brad's jokes ceased. Riley listened to the transmissions with the same steady attention she always used when reading terrain. The valley they reported in sounded exactly like the one she had flagged in a morning brief. A bowl of ground with ridges forming a three-sided trap. She had drawn lines on maps and annotated angles of approach. Her report had been met with a shrug. Leadership prioritized other routes. Now the scenario she had predicted unfolded in real time. Operations on the floor tried what they could. Drones were repositioned, chains of command pinged for air support. The situation darkened further when reports came in that a dust storm was moving through the area, grounding helicopters and reducing visibility that would make supporting fires unreliable. With air assets limited, with terrain stacked against the trapped Rangers, the call for a ground solution became urgent. If those soldiers could not be reached quickly, their chances would collapse as the storm moved in. Inside the TOC, Riley stood with a measured breathing pattern that revealed nothing yet prepared everything. The instinct she had suppressed for years surfaced like a hungry thing. She did not panic. Instead, her mind spun through distances and angles with quiet clarity. The overwatch ridge that could see the valley floor had gone unassigned, no shooter on post capable of the long shot. She knew the position and the shot and the calculus that meant the difference between extraction and casualty. She spoke then, voice even and direct. She could take the overwatch ridge. The room snapped to attention. Her submission was not a plea. It was a statement of capacity. Colonel Avery Dalton froze for a beat, not at her offer so much as at the tone, a voice that reminded him of someone who once turned engagements with a single shot. The men who had scorned her a minute earlier watched in confusion as the contractor moved out. She did not hurry. Her movement to the armory was unremarkable to anyone not looking for the traces of a soldier. Master Sergeant Raymond Holt, the armorer, recognized the type of person approaching in the way he recognized the hum of a finely tuned weapon. He opened a locked cabinet that sat unused and brought out a precision rifle wrapped in a protective cloth. It was a tool kept idle for years, the kind of instrument that needed hands who understood its temper. Holt slid a case of match-grade rounds onto the counter with reverence. He did not ask paperwork questions. He passed the rifle across and watched her take it, as if he had returned an instrument to the only person who could wield it with purpose. A convoy rolled out to the valley with engines throwing up a cloud of dust. Riley took the last vehicle, and Sergeant Turner, rugged and impatient, rode in beside her. He barked orders. He resented civilian intervention. He told her to stay close and keep from making mistakes. She accepted the instruction by not reacting, her focus already anchored on the ridge lines ahead. They dismounted at a cut in the terrain where vehicles could go no farther. The climb to the ridge was steep and punished every step with loose rock and whipping wind. Riley moved with efficiency, each motion economical and practiced. Turner wondered aloud at her chosen path, but she simply kept climbing until she crested a jagged shelf of stone that offered a commanding view. She set the weapon with a ritual of care. Each adjustment was precise. Her movements were not fast but absolute, the hands of someone who had measured tempo in breaths and meant to control the cadence of conflict from a distance. Her field of view narrowed to the scope, a glass circle framing a valley that roiled with gunfire and scatter. Below, a medic was exposed while dressing a chest wound. A hunter had slipped from cover and aimed at the small group assisting the wounded. The radio's calls sounded thin and frayed. There are moments that recalibrate the world. Riley's first shot cleaved across the hard air and ended the immediate threat to the medic. It was a single, precise intervention that rewove the balance below. Static gave way to stunned silence. The QRF staff looked up at angles and tried to parse the improbable. Questions traveled over the net, searching for an identity to pin to that one life-saving round. Colonel Dalton, watching feeds and personnel records, recognized what others missed. Riley Monroe's file, the record of a soldier whose name had long been rumored across deployments for an uncanny capacity to place a shot precisely at critical times, appeared on the screen. The ghost of a battlefield legend, stories turned into rumor, took on shape in the TOC. Operators watched the ridge line and recognized not only the precision of the rounds, but the hand that guided them. Her presence made the men below recalibrate their posture. Where earlier they had dismissed her, now they moved with a new caution that bordered on reverence. She did not seek it. She only focused on the task. Calls came over the radio with the new clarity of coordinated movement. Keep behind cover, follow the shot caller. Captain Ridge, simultaneously relieved and unsettled, issued directions that trusted the unseen hand above. Riley's work on the ridge went beyond simple marksmanship. She adjusted for wind, accounted for dust that warped trajectories, and moved her aim to insulate the platoon from flanking movements. Each impact redirected the ambush, thinned the danger, and carved pathways for the QRF to advance. Specialist Dana Brooks, tending a wounded comrade, felt rescue in a form she could not see, but that acted as a steadying force. The QRF moved with confidence they did not possess minutes earlier. They had someone watching the geometry of their fight. Then the weather broke open. A fierce dust storm rolled through, and the valley vanished under a choking veil. Visibility dropped to mere footsteps. Radios sputtered with static and breath. Men coughed and pressed hands to their faces. Under that chaos, Riley continued to read micro changes in the environment. She watched how gusts pushed dust and how silhouettes shifted, compensating for unseen forces that would have undone a less experienced shooter. She intercepted threats that tried to crawl through the storm and neutralized them in a way that made the rescuers below feel the touch of luck, or something like fate. When the storm yawned past and the last of the wounded were evacuated, the mood at the assembly point was raw. Captain Ridge moved toward the ridge, dust streaked across his face, lungs working on borrowed air. He began to thank the person who had given his men a chance, but the woman on the ridge stepped back from recognition. She declined spotlight and deferential bows. Her actions had been necessary. The quiet acceptance that followed was born of someone who preferred the work to the applause. Colonel Dalton found her afterwards, the two of them under the shorn light of evening. He spoke with the weight of command and gratitude. She answered with a nod and a short statement that mirrored the posture of someone who had made countless hard decisions without needing consolation. She was steady in a way that did not require others' approval. Later that night, a medic named Dana, still shaken by the taste of dust and iron, approached the woman who had saved her life. Words of blame and guilt spilled out from the younger soldier, a reach for closure. Riley absorbed them with the compassion of someone who knew too well the limits of saving. She offered instruction that did not absolve pain, but reframed responsibility. Save who can still be pulled back, and carry the rest with honor. That exchange, quiet and unspectacular, was a reminder that heroism does not always roar. It often arrives as a steadying hand. Under the stars, the FOB settled into a hush that felt like reverence. Riley sat with her rifle case closed at her side, refusing accolades but holding the knowledge of what the day had cost and what it had saved. For her, honor had always been quieter than medals and longer than fame. It lived in choices made when no camera bore witness. On that ridge, she had chosen to stop being invisible when lives depended on it, and then return to the place where she had promised herself peace. The act altered nobody's assumptions about who she was, except perhaps for a few who would think on the memory long after the dust settled. After the extraction, the base was slower to return to business as usual than the clockwork of deployment allowed. People moved deliberately, haunted by the close brush with loss. Debriefings cycled through the command tent, radios recorded timelines, medics triaged for shock and physical wounds. A handful of names had been saved. For many, the image that remained was not the glare of illumination on the ridge, but the quiet hands that passed out bandages and the steady voice that directed them. The person who had operated from a place no one expected. Riley did not look for praise. Her life had been changed by a single moment of betrayal long ago, and she had reassembled herself around the principle of anonymity. Having stepped forward once, she returned to the same small rituals that anchored her. A carefully arranged desk, exact folds in reports, a rhythm of screens and radios. Yet the day's events had reconfigured how others saw her. There was a new awareness in their glances, edged with something like respect, though she did not ask for it. Colonel Dalton found chances to acknowledge what had been done, but he also respected the woman's privacy. He gave orders that reflected gratitude, provide her the support she needed, ensure she had access to the resources required if she chose to re-engage. He did not force commendations on a person who had made a conscious decision to step away from public recognition. There is a leadership that insists upon medals, and there is leadership that recognizes the dignity of someone who prefers the work alone. He chose the latter. The aftermath rippled beyond the base. Rumors of the ghost on the ridge traveled across channels, blurred by retelling into legend. For Riley, the legend was irrelevant. She cared about outcomes, the men who had been evacuated, the medics who could again move without fear, the QRF that would go home that night. The story she carried was not for paper. It had to do with the shape of responsibility and the small mercies that decided whether a life continued. That night, in the small hours, Riley walked the perimeter alone. The base lights threw thin cones across the sand, marking safe lanes and exposing the ordinary order of life in a theater of operations. She moved with the quiet gait she had adopted to vanish. Around her, people laughed softly in the mess, checked gear, or sat in tired circles swapping tales. She watched the rhythm of human need, the men waiting for sleep to absolve them, the medics disinfecting hands, the engineers fixing radios. She had once believed that leaving the line meant letting go of duty. That belief had been partial. Duty had followed, in different forms and in different quiets. Specialist Dana Brooks came to seek her out. Up close, the young medic looked as if the wind had carved new lines into her face. She had the stillness of someone who had borne weight and found some of it unbearable. She approached Riley without much ceremony and asked something that was less about gratitude and more about understanding. Riley offered counsel drawn from experience and loss, not absolution. She spoke of measured care, of how to survive in a role that asks so much and gives so little external comfort. The younger woman listened, holding the words like a map. Conversations like that changed more than one evening. They were exchanges where skill met humanity, where lessons were practical and also moral. Riley could explain sight picture and wind correction to any trainee. But what she gave now also reached into how a medic processes guilt, or how a commander shoulders the knowledge that not every choice yields life. The exchange that night was a line of continuity between people who had different pieces of the same world. Word of Riley's involvement reached ears beyond the FOB. There were those who wanted to push her back toward familiar roles, and those content to keep the memory of her action in private. Some suggested she re-enlist. Others recommended recognition in the form of commendations. Riley's answer was the same. She had no desire for spectacle. Her sense of purpose was not aligned with titles. She wanted to do right by people when needed, and then go back to her chosen quiet. She had reconciled the part of her that once depended on a rifle with the part of her that sought life beyond it. Still, action leaves marks. People asked questions about why she made the choices she did, why she had left the rifle in the corner of her life for so many years. The answers were never neat. A mixture of protest at command failures, the pain of betrayal that followed candidness, and a careful carving of autonomy from instruments of war. It was not about heroism. It was about an oath to oneself. She had learned that reclaiming agency was as important as saving life. On the ridge, she had chosen to intervene. Afterwards, she chose to remain the person she had crafted in exile, deliberate, small, and private. As days passed, routines shifted slightly. The FOB ran its cycles, missions dispatched, and threats scanned. Riley continued to produce quality intelligence, but now operators and rangers read her work with an attention shaded by the knowledge of what she had done. Small acts of courtesy began to appear. A hot cup of coffee left on the edge of her desk, an armorer offering a nod in passing, a captain asking for her assessment before a patrol. None of it changed her priorities, though it softened the environment around her. One afternoon, some weeks after the ambush, the same ranger who had once mocked her walked past her desk with a different expression. He did not offer praise. He simply inclined his head in acknowledgement and moved on. The gesture was small but telling. It signaled that old calculations about who had value were shifting, that competence would not be erased by a person's desire for privacy. Time did not erase what had happened in the valley. It integrated it into the base's memory. The men who lived because of that day continued to process the experience. Some of them were physically healed, but haunted by a sense of things they had not controlled. Riley did not pretend to deliver consolation. Instead, she remained available in the ways she could be, with counsel, with precise analysis, with a continued willingness to step up if the situation called. That approach earned respect that no ceremony could replicate. At night, she sometimes sat with Dalton, not in public but in private conversation when schedules allowed. They discussed risk calculus and the human cost of orders. The colonel was a man for whom duty weighed like a constant hourglass. He had seen too many things to flatter himself with simple answers, and he listened to her in a way that was rare for men of his rank. They were not friends in a casual sense, but they held mutual regard, shaped by the day that altered how they both viewed responsibility. In quiet moments visited her as well. When she shelved the rifle she had drawn on that day, she set it with the care of someone who both valued and feared it. The weapon was a tool that could be used for salvation or for ruin. Her relationship to it was complicated by memory and by the vow she had made. She had not burned bridges with the past so much as rerouted how it touched her present life. The story of the valley continued to circulate in quiet channels and passed into the lore of units that rotated through the FOB. Some told it as a tale of miraculous marksmanship. Others framed it as an episode about the importance of listening to intelligence. For Riley, the narrative had a different weight. It was a reminder that silence could be both armor and prison, that stepping forward cost a person something, and that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the very rules one created to survive. Months later, when routine returned more fully, and the memory of that afternoon settled into cadence instead of acute sting, a younger soldier recounted the episode to a new arrival. He described a woman on a ridge who took a single life-preserving decision and then retreated from the spotlight by choice. To the listener, the tale read like a parable: competence without need for reward, courage without applause. It was what Riley understood to be true. On an evening much like the one when it had all begun, she walked the same perimeter and found a younger version of Dana adjusting a dressing under a lamp. The medic glanced up and offered a nod that carried a mixture of gratitude and resolve. Riley returned the gesture and kept walking. She would not accept accolades, nor did she need them. Her reward was the certainty that, when pushed, she followed the thing that mattered most. She had saved lives and then returned to being a careful presence, a person who measured her steps not by public recognition, but by the quietness she carved out in the aftermath. In the end, the defining image of that day was not a photograph or a headline. It was a set of choices layered together, a decision to act, a refusal to be celebrated, and the small kindnesses afterward that helped others stitch the day back into their lives. Riley Monroe's action at the Overwatch Ridge became one story among many, in a landscape crowded with brave decisions. It was a reminder that heroism need not be performed for crowds. Sometimes it is enacted simply because no other option existed. He looked ordinary, almost too ordinary, but as the commander on stage scanned the faces in the audience, his eyes locked on the man's forearm, just for a split second. There it was, a tattoo, small, faded, half-hidden under a rolled sleeve. The commander froze mid-sentence. His jaw tightened, his voice faltered. The crowd noticed. Cameras went still. The Navy SEAL demonstration at Coronado drew hundreds that morning. Families, recruits, tourists, and veterans. Among the crowd stood one man, quiet, hands in his pockets, sunglasses hiding eyes that had seen too much. And in that moment, one thought burned in the commander's mind. That mark shouldn't exist. Not anymore. What happened next would unravel secrets never meant to surface. The demonstration continued, but the commander's eyes kept drifting back to the man in the crowd. While SEALs leapt from helicopters and stormed mock compounds, he wasn't watching the show. He was watching the stranger. After it ended, security began ushering people toward the exits. Families snapped photos, kids begged for autographs, but the commander slipped off the stage, moving toward the crowd like a predator stalking prey. The man didn't notice at first. He was staring at the flag whipping in the bay wind, his hand resting on the tattoo like a reflex. But then he felt it, eyes on him, heavy, piercing, unmistakable. "Sir," a guard said, "the commander would like a word." The crowd parted as the commander approached. People whispered, confused. Why would the highest-ranking officer single out this one man? The commander's voice was low but sharp. "Where did you get that tattoo?" The man hesitated. He glanced down at his arm, then back up. "Old memory," he said quietly, but the commander wasn't convinced. His face was pale, his fists clenched. "That's no memory," he whispered. "That's a ghost." Within minutes, the man was escorted into a restricted building near the docks. Not under arrest, not exactly, but guarded, contained. He sat across from the commander in a dim room, walls humming with the buzz of fluorescent lights. "Name," the commander demanded. The man hesitated, then answered softly, "David Kane." The commander's eyes narrowed. He'd read thousands of rosters, known hundreds of operators, but that name didn't match the tattoo. "You served?" the commander pressed. David leaned back. "I served, but not in the way you're thinking." Silence thickened between them. The commander finally spoke again. "That tattoo, only one unit ever carried it, and they don't exist anymore. Not on paper, not in memory, not even in whispers. They were erased." David didn't flinch. He simply stared back, unblinking. Then maybe I'm not supposed to exist either. The commander's chest tightened. For the first time in years he felt fear, not of David Kane, but of the truth he represented. Hours passed. Files were pulled, phone calls made. The name David Kane appeared in no record, no database, no archive. It was as though he'd been scrubbed from history. Finally, the commander returned to the room. He dropped a single object on the table. A classified file, its cover stamped with bold red letters, erased. "Tell me," the commander demanded, "what mission are you here for? Why now?" David looked at the file but didn't touch it. His voice was calm. "I'm not here for a mission. I came to watch, to remember." The commander shook his head. "Men like you don't come back to remember. That tattoo, it was the mark of Task Echo." David's eyes flickered for the first time. Task Echo, the black unit, the one whispered about in rumors, operators sent into missions with no return, no credit, no names. "You were supposed to be gone," the commander said softly. "You were supposed to have died with the rest." David leaned forward, voice low. "Not all of us died." As the hours turned to night, David began to speak. His words were slow, deliberate, like peeling back layers of a wound that had never healed. Years ago, Task Echo had been deployed on missions so dangerous they made headlines only as mysterious explosions or unexplained disappearances. They carried no flags, wore no patches, left no trace. One mission changed everything. A rescue deep in hostile territory. They weren't supposed to succeed. They weren't even supposed to survive. But David and a handful of others did, barely. When they returned, instead of medals, they were erased. Their names deleted, their lives wiped, their existence denied. "You want to know why I came back?" David said. "Because one of ours is still alive, taken, hidden. And if I stay silent, he dies forgotten, just like they planned for all of us." The commander felt his throat tighten. Everything he'd believed about clean rosters and clear orders now crumbled. At dawn, a storm gathered over the bay. David stood at the docks, gear bag slung over his shoulder, waiting. The commander approached, his face hard with resolve. "Where is he?" he asked. David handed him a folded map, marked in red. "Jungle, off the grid. You won't find it on any satellite feed, but I know the path. I walked it once." The commander stared at the map, then at David. If this was true, it meant breaking rules, crossing lines, disobeying direct orders. "You know this could end both our careers," the commander said. David's voice was steady. "I lost my career a long time ago. This isn't about us. It's about bringing him home." Moments later, the engines of a transport aircraft roared to life. A small team boarded, men the commander trusted with his life. And in the middle of them, the ghost from Task Echo, stepping back into a world he thought he'd left forever. Night fell heavy as they dropped from the sky. Halo jump, silent descent into hostile territory. The jungle swallowed them whole. Rain hammered the leaves. Every step forward carried memories David wished he could bury. Hours passed before they reached the compound. Lights glared through barbed wire, armed guards patrolled, and deep inside, one prisoner. "Ready?" the commander whispered. David's grip tightened on his rifle. "I've been ready for 10 years. The fight was brutal. Explosions rocked the night. Gunfire shredded the silence. David moved like a shadow, faster than men half his age, each strike a reminder that ghosts never truly die. At last they reached the cell. Inside was a man barely alive, chained, beaten, but breathing. His eyes lifted weakly. "David?" he whispered. David's throat burned. Against all odds, his brother in arms had survived. "We're getting you out," David said, breaking the chains. The escape was chaos. Alarms, bullets, fire. But step by step, yard by yard, they carved their way through. David took a round to the shoulder but kept going, dragging his comrade through the storm of death until the evac bird roared overhead. As they lifted into the sky, flames consumed the compound. Below them, enemies scattered in panic. Above them, the night opened like freedom. Back at Coronado, there were no parades, no speeches, no medals. David Kane stood once more at the edge of the crowd, silent, blending in as if nothing had happened. But this time, the commander walked up in front of everyone. No hesitation, no secrecy, and in full view of recruits, families, and officers, he raised his hand in a crisp salute, directed at David. The crowd gasped. Cameras clicked. David stood still, eyes dark with memories, but for the first time his shoulders eased. He returned the salute slowly, knowing this one act said what no file ever could. He had existed. He had mattered. And though his name would never appear in records, the truth had been witnessed. Some heroes don't need medals. They just need someone to remember. They erased his name. They erased his past, but they couldn't erase the courage burned into his soul. He was never supposed to exist, and yet he did. Sometimes the greatest stories are the ones hidden in silence, until the right moment brings them back to light.